Texas, autumn 1945. The war was over, but the trains kept coming. Every few weeks, another transport rolled through the scrubland outside Camp Kennedy. Dozens of women from the Pacific Theater, former Army nurses, clerks, and civilian volunteers captured in the final months of the war. They arrived pale from the voyage, their uniforms threadbare, their eyes hollow from months of uncertainty. When the boxcars opened that October morning, heat hit them like an open oven. The sky was endless and white. Cicadas screamed in the mesquite trees. The women squinted toward a line of men waiting beyond the fence, U.S. guards in clean khaki shirts, their sleeves rolled neatly, their boots polished until they threw back the sun. "They look like movie stars," one woman whispered. The translator beside her frowned, unsure if he had heard correctly. Another prisoner giggled nervously. "Actors," she added in Japanese, hiding her mouth behind her hand. "All of them." The guards pretended not to notice, but the whisper traveled down the line like a spark through dry grass. After years of seeing only soldiers with gaunt faces and torn uniforms, these Americans looked impossibly composed, tall, sun-browned, and smiling without menace. It felt less like captivity and more like stepping into a scene from a film they'd once watched before the war, a film about a distant, confident country untouched by bombs. Among the prisoners was Aiko Tanaka, 26, a surgical nurse from Osaka who had worked through the last raids before Japan's surrender. Her right hand still trembled from shrapnel that had grazed her wrist months earlier, but she carried herself with quiet poise. She had told herself not to trust anything American, not the food, not the smiles, not the strange courtesy. But when one of the guards tipped his cap and said softly, "Welcome, ma'am," her practiced caution faltered. No enemy had ever called her ma'am. They were marched through the gates and to the compound that once held German mechanics. The buildings were simple wood, the air thick with dust, and the scent of pine soap from a nearby barracks. Every step they took made the boards creak like old stairs in a temple. That evening, when rations were served, white bread, beans, and coffee, the women stared in disbelief. Sugar, butter, and meat on a prisoner's tray felt like absurd luxury. Aiko tasted the bread first, and it nearly brought tears. Not because it was sweet, but because it was soft. After dinner, the guards allowed them to walk the yard under supervision. The Texas sun had cooled the gold, painting the wire fences amber. The Americans leaned on their rifles loosely, chatting about baseball and harvest fairs. The prisoners listened without understanding, but caught words that sounded like laughter, real laughter, unguarded. From the corner of the yard, Yumi Sato, 22, pointed discreetly toward one guard leaning against a post, his cap tilted back. "His face," she whispered to Aiko. "He could be in those American magazines. The ones we weren't supposed to read." Aiko hushed her, but even she smiled. "Don't stare." "I'm not staring," Yumi said. "I'm studying." That night in the barracks, the whisper returned. They combed their hair every morning. They polished their boots until they shine like mirrors. Do you think they practiced smiling? The laughter that followed was quiet, restrained, but it was laughter nonetheless, the first since the surrender. Days passed. The camp routines became familiar: roll call, work detail, English lessons offered by a local volunteer. What surprised the women most was not the food or the freedom of movement, but the way the Americans looked at them, not as enemies, not as curiosities, but as people. When one woman stumbled carrying a crate, a guard instinctively reached to steady her arm, then stepped back, embarrassed. "Sorry, miss," he said. The translator explained, and the entire group fell silent. The idea of an American soldier apologizing to a Japanese prisoner was almost unthinkable. That evening, a Red Cross officer visited the compound with a photographer. The women were asked to stand in rows for documentation. The flashbulb popped, capturing expressions somewhere between fear and disbelief. Later, as the photograph developed, Aiko caught a glimpse in the darkroom, their faces framed by sunlight, the guards behind them at ease. For a moment, she imagined the picture without uniforms. It could have been a group of strangers at a picnic, not enemies divided by war. The next morning, Captain Harold Mason, the officer in charge of the compound, walked through the yard with a notebook. He was a calm man in his mid-30s who spoke softly and disliked shouting. Discipline through decency, he often said. When asked by visiting officers why he allowed the Japanese women to keep their hair ribbons or hang cloth curtains by the barrack windows, his answer was simple: because dignity doesn't threaten security. One afternoon, Mason passed the infirmary where Aiko was helping bandage a guard's hand. He had cut it fixing a gate hinge. Mason watched silently as she worked, efficient, precise, professional. When she finished, she bowed slightly and stepped back. The guard looked embarrassed. Aiko nodded once. "You are welcome." That night, Mason wrote a note in his log. "These women are nurses, not prisoners in spirit. The way they look at us, and the way my men look back, might be the beginning of peace." By the third week, the atmosphere inside the camp had changed completely. The guards had stopped calling them the J-Girls and started using names. Aiko became Miss Aiko. Yumi was Sato-san. In the evenings, the women stood by the fence watching sunsets bleed across the plains. Sometimes a guard would hum a tune. Sometimes one of the women would hum back, echoing it softly in Japanese. The melodies overlapped in strange harmony, two languages finding rhythm in the same warm air. It was in those quiet twilights that the whisper returned. "They still look like actors." But now the laughter behind it carried something new: affection. Inside the officers' quarters, Mason received a telegram from the regional command. Public interest in POW integration rising. Maintain humane conditions. Prepare report on morale among female internees. He folded the paper, looked out the window, and saw the women at the pump, their sleeves rolled, water sparkling in the sun. For the first time since the war began, he allowed himself to believe that humanity could survive orders. And in the barracks, as evening settled, Aiko wrote her first letter home. "Mother, the Americans are not what we were told. They laugh. They smile. They look like actors, yes, but perhaps they are just men trying to look brave when they are tired. I am safe. Do not worry." She sealed the letter, unsure if it would ever reach Japan. But it felt good to write something that was not fear. Outside, the guards changed shifts. The sound of their boots on gravel faded into the crickets. The women turned off the lamps one by one, leaving only moonlight on the walls. And somewhere between the wire and the sky, the idea of the enemy began to dissolve. The wind changed at dawn. It came rolling across the Texas plains, a low, dusty growl that carried grit into every seam of the barracks. The women woke coughing, clutching scarves over their mouths as the sky outside turned the color of rust. "A sandstorm," one of the locals said, "a blue norther sweeping in from the desert." Captain Mason ordered everyone inside, but the old barracks had gaps wide enough to let the world through. Sheets of dust curled under the door frames, coating the floors, the cots, the prisoners' hair. Aiko and Yumi worked fast, tying wet towels over the cracks. One guard tried to close the outer gate, but the wind fought him back, flinging his hat into the yard. When the storm hit full force, it felt like the sky had dropped its weight on the camp. The guards disappeared into the haze, their outlines swallowed by the swirling orange. Inside, the women huddled together, covering their eyes. Every few seconds came the sound of metal clanging, some loose sheet roofing somewhere outside. Suddenly, the barrack door flew open, banging against the wall. A gust of dust roared in, carrying with it two shapes, American soldiers, faces wrapped in scarves, eyes squinting through goggles. "You've got to move to the mess hall," one shouted over the wind. "This roof's not holding." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Mason appeared behind them, voice steady. "Come on, ladies. Let's go." The women rose as one. Aiko grabbed the youngest, 17-year-old Keiko, who was shaking so hard she could barely stand. "Hold my hand," Aiko said in English, the words rough but clear. Outside, the storm clawed at their clothes. Sand stung their faces like needles. The guards formed a line, hands outstretched, guiding the women through the murk toward the main building. Halfway there, Yumi lost her footing. The wind lifted her scarf clean off her head, her hair whipping across her face. One of the Americans, Private Lewis, the one they'd called the tall actor, turned back, scooped her up, and carried her the last 20 yards. When they reached the mess hall, the women stumbled inside coughing, eyes red. The guards slammed the doors shut and braced them with benches. For a while, no one spoke. Only the sound of the storm outside filled the space, a steady growl that made the lamps tremble. Aiko looked around. The men were covered in the same dust as they were, faces streaked, uniforms caked, no trace of movie star polish left. Private Lewis sat on the floor beside the door, coughing, sand still clinging to his lashes. When he looked up, Yumi met his eyes and managed a small smile. He laughed weakly. "Guess I don't look like an actor now, huh?" The translator repeated the words. The women laughed softly, and even Mason allowed himself a grin. The tension cracked like thin ice. For the first time, the guards and prisoners shared the same exhaustion, the same mess, the same breath of survival. Hours passed. The storm raged without pause, so the Americans handed out canteens of water, bits of bread, even a tin of peaches. The women passed the can around, eating carefully, sharing the sweetness one spoonful at a time. When the wind finally eased, the air in the hall was thick with the smell of sand and sweat and metal. Someone started humming, a tune Aiko recognized from home, a lullaby her mother used to sing. When she finished, one of the guards tapped his boot lightly, matching the rhythm. Another joined, clapping softly. Then a third guard began humming something different, slow, deep, American. The two melodies twined together, half in Japanese, half in English, until the entire hall filled with quiet sound. By nightfall, the storm was gone. The stars returned as if nothing had happened. The women helped sweep the sand into small piles, laughing when they sneezed or when someone discovered half a biscuit buried under the dust. Mason leaned in the doorway, watching, shaking his head. "You'd never guess we were supposed to hate each other," he murmured. The next morning, sunlight turned the camp gold again. The fences shone clean, the sky a washed-out blue. Private Lewis stood outside the women's barracks, hat in hand. "You all right?" he asked the translator. "No one sick?" Aiko stepped forward before the translator could answer. "We are fine," she said, carefully pronouncing each word. "You saved us." Lewis smiled awkwardly. "Just doing my job, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment, then bowed slightly. "You are good actor," she said, grinning shyly. He laughed. "I'll take that." That afternoon, Captain Mason gathered the guards. "You see what happened out there," he said. "You keep telling yourself these people are enemies. You'll miss the moment when they stop being that. You did good work yesterday. You protected lives. That's what matters." When he left, Louis muttered, "Feels strange, sir. Saving people we were told to hate." Mason nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's how peace feels at first. Strange." Inside the barracks, Yumi found her scarf buried in the dust by the fence. She brushed it off and tied it back around her hair, the same way it had been the day she arrived. Then she caught her reflection in a bucket of water and laughed softly. "I look like a ghost," she said. Aiko joined her. "No," she replied, "you look like someone who survived." They sat under the eaves, watching the guards rebuild the gate hinge. The same men they had once whispered about were now covered in sweat and dirt, faces ordinary, human. Yumi turned to Aiko. "Not actors after all." Aiko shook her head. No, she said. Just men in the same storm. That evening, Mason visited the barracks to check on them. Aiko handed him a folded note, her attempt at English. It read simply, "Thank you for not letting the wind take us." He smiled, folded it carefully, and put it in his breast pocket. Later that night, as the camp settled under a pale moon, the women gathered by the small window. They could hear a radio from the guard's post, a soft jazz melody drifting through the air. One of them whispered, "They play music even after war." Aiko answered quietly, "Maybe that's how they forget." But deep inside, she knew it wasn't forgetting. It was remembering differently. The next day, the telegram came, orders for inspection, news that repatriation lists were being prepared. Soon the women would be sent home. The guards didn't cheer, but the air in the camp shifted again, anticipation mixed with something bittersweet. Private Lewis approached Aiko near the gate. "Guess this is goodbye soon," he said. "You'll be heading home." Aiko looked at him, her English halting but clear. "I think home is not same." He nodded. "No, never is after a storm." For a moment, neither spoke. The fence between them cast two long shadows that almost touched in the afternoon light. When dusk fell, the women gathered to wash the dust from their hair. The water turned the color of the storm, running down into the earth. The air smelled faintly of soap and something hopeful. Aiko looked toward the guard post and saw Lewis lift his cap in a small salute. She smiled back. "Good actor," she whispered again, and the other women laughed softly behind her. But that night when she wrote her letter, she didn't use the word actor anymore. She wrote, "Mother, the Americans are strange men. They fight, but they also help. They laugh, even when the wind howls. They are not what we were told. They are just people trying to stand upright in a broken world, same as us." Outside, the Texas stars burned steady over the camp. The fences no longer seemed so high. Winter crept into Texas quietly that year. The mesquite trees shed their leaves, and the nights stretched longer over Camp Kennedy. For the Japanese women inside, time began to soften, marked less by fear and more by routine. The same roll call, the same meals, the same sunrises that came without gunfire. It was strange how peace could feel almost foreign. Aiko had stopped counting the days. Instead, she kept a small journal she made from wrapping paper and string. Every night she wrote one sentence in English, a habit that had started after the sandstorm. "Wind strong today. We are safe." American Guard smile. "We clean laundry together." The words were simple, clumsy, but they steadied her. By December, the U.S. Army had begun the repatriation process. Lists circulated through the compound, and the women gathered in clusters, reading names aloud. Yumi found hers quickly, tracing the letters as if they might vanish. Sado, Yumi, Osaka. Aiko's name was there too, followed by Tanaka, Aiko nurse, civilian transport. She should have felt joy, but instead her chest tightened. For months this dusty camp had been the edge of the world, the place where fear had unraveled and something new had taken root. She wasn't sure she was ready to leave it behind. That afternoon, the guards began dismantling the outer fence in preparation for the women's transfer to the rail station. The sound of hammers echoed through the air, strangely rhythmic. The prisoners watched from a distance as the barbed wire sagged and fell. Private Lewis passed by carrying a wooden post. "Never thought I'd be taking this down," he said to Mason. The captain grunted, wiping his hands. "Funny thing about fences," he replied. "You build them to keep danger out. Then one day you realize they kept your own heart locked in, too." Inside the barracks, the women were packing their few possessions: folded dresses, worn shoes, letters, scraps of photographs. Aiko slipped her English notebook into her pocket, then paused at the doorway. The sunlight slanted across the yard where the guards were finishing their work. For a moment, she thought of that first day, the heat, the dust, the laughter about how the Americans looked like actors. They still looked that way sometimes, tall, confident, out of place in this land of red dirt. But she had seen them covered in sand and sweat, bleeding from splinters, coughing through storms. They were not actors anymore. That evening, Captain Mason held a brief assembly outside the mess hall. He stood before the group, guards on one side, prisoners on the other, and cleared his throat. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "you'll board the train to Galveston. From there, ships will take you home. You've conducted yourselves with dignity, and I thank you for that. I hope when you remember this place, you remember the days that were peaceful." The translator repeated his words in Japanese. When he finished, no one moved. The air was still, heavy with everything that couldn't be said. Then Aiko stepped forward, clutching her small notebook. "Captain," she said softly, "we remember. People were kind." He nodded, the corners of his mouth twitching into the faintest smile. "That's all I could ask." The night before departure, the women couldn't sleep. They sat in a circle inside the dim barrack, sharing the last of their sugar ration. Yumi brushed her hair carefully, humming under her breath. "When we go back," she whispered, "they'll never believe this story." Aiko smiled. "Then tell them anyway." "I'll tell them the Americans look like movie stars," Yumi teased. "Sinot." "And what will you say?" another woman asked Aiko. She hesitated, looking at her hands. "I'll say they looked like peace before we knew what peace was." Before sunrise, trucks lined up outside the gate. The guards formed a quiet row along the path. The air was cold enough that breath steamed in front of every face. The women climbed aboard one by one, clutching their small bags. When Aiko reached the truck bed, she turned back. Mason stood near the guard post with Lewis beside him. She raised her hand hesitantly. Lewis lifted his cap in return. For a moment, the distance between them didn't matter. Then, without warning, Yumi leaned out from the truck and shouted, "Actors!" The guards laughed, the sound rippling through the dawn. Mason shook his head, smiling. "Guess we'll never live that down," he muttered. The engines rumbled to life. As the convoy pulled away, Aiko looked through the slats at the receding camp, the fences gone, the buildings bathed in soft light. For a long moment, she thought she saw the Texas horizon blur with the sea she'd left behind in Japan. Months later, when the ship carrying the women reached Yokohama, Aiko stood on deck staring at the coastline. The city was a skeleton of what she remembered: rubble, cranes, smoke. She stepped onto the dock and breathed the familiar salt air, but it no longer felt like home. At a Red Cross station near the harbor, she was given a bowl of rice, a blanket, and a pencil to register her name. On impulse, she opened her English notebook and began to write a letter. "Dear Captain Mason, we are home now, though it does not look like home. The sky is gray, but people are rebuilding. We remember your kindness. I teach English now to children who never saw war. When they laugh, it sounds like Texas wind after a storm. Please tell Private Lewis that we are well. Tell him we do not call him an actor anymore. We call him friend." She folded the letter carefully and handed it to a Red Cross volunteer bound for America. Whether it reached him or not, she never knew. Years later, long after the camp had been dismantled and turned into farmland, Mason visited Texas again. He stopped near the spot where the fence had once stood. A single mesquite tree had grown there, twisting upward into the empty sky. He sat beneath it, the letter in his coat pocket, yellowed, edges frayed. Lewis had passed away years before, but Mason still reread Aiko's words sometimes when he doubted what the war had meant. The handwriting was uneven, the grammar imperfect, but the message was clear. They looked like actors, but they acted with mercy, and mercy is what changed us. He folded the letter and slipped it back into his pocket. The wind brushed through the branches, dry and warm. Somewhere, far away, he could almost hear laughter carried across time, the kind that starts in fear and ends in understanding. When Aiko grew old, she told her grandchildren about the Americans in Texas. Not about the war or the ships or the fences, but about the morning they walked through dust together and came out laughing. They looked like actors, she would say, her voice soft with memory. But they were real. And sometimes real kindness is the best performance there is. Then she would smile and close her eyes, hearing again the sound of wind against wood, the warmth of sunlight on her face, and the strange, unforgettable laughter that had once crossed a fence and changed her forever.